Good morning, everyone, to MHQ's Foundation 101, now in its fourth installment, no less. And today we are going into perhaps the most topical theme of them all, is how foundations are compatible for legacy planning for Muslims. If you recall, what we are attempting to do here with this modest podcast is to put foundation in context. Foundations have had a substantial impact on the way assets are structured and restructured in the UAE and the Gulf at large since their introduction 2 years ago. And our objective is to tackle them from all angles, giving a practical perspective to whoever entrepreneur, investor, or advisors would want to use these tools to improve their or their clients' situation. And today I'm joined by Célia Titouni. Célia, good morning.
Good morning.
And we will really try to shine a light on what has been one of the most sought after solution in the Gulf for many years, is how Muslims can effectively plan, protect, using a tool that was not available a couple of years ago, but is now. So if I can ask you briefly, before we go into specific topics, put this into context. Why does legacy matter, and why does it matter so much in the Gulf as a whole?
So I'm sure you have heard this in the past, but over the next 10 years, assets worth an estimated of $1 trillion are about to go from one generation to another in the Gulf region alone. But at the same time, only one family out of 7 has some sort of legacy plan in place. These assets are mostly composed of real estate and businesses, and they are at risk every day. Business risk, political risk, family disputes, you name it. But now succession is a risk that families, Muslim or non-Muslim, can control and plan using foundations.
So before we talk about the tools per se, let's look at succession in context. What are the succession rules in the UAE, be it for Muslims or non-Muslim? How does it work?
So a bit of theory here. The legal basis for inheritance in the UAE is found in both the Personal Affairs Law, which is a codification of Sharia, and in the Civil Code. Both of the Personal Affairs Law and the Civil Code provide that inheritance has to be governed by the law of the deceased at the time of the death. What does this mean? It means the law of one person's country or community. For non-Muslims, the UAE gives the possibility to elect your own law to govern inheritance, but this will only be applied by UAE courts if you have a will.
So election of rights possible for non-Muslim. What about Muslims?
Sharia will apply, so this will apply regardless of your nationality. The exact divisions prescribed by Sharia are going to vary depending on the gender and the family situation, so we will not go through that, obviously. There are different categories of heirs. That includes forced heirs. Heirs must be Muslims, and they cannot willfully have caused the death of the deceased. You must also know that illegitimate or adopted children are excluded from being heirs. But then, this being said, the exact portion surrounding how we're going to calculate the distribution of assets will have to be determined on a case-by-case basis during what we call the probate procedure, opened with local courts, and a Sharia scholar will be appointed to decide on how the distribution will go. Then, of course, that's something the auditors will be familiar with, the infamous 2-to-1 proportion, with male having twice as much as their correspondent female heir. Lastly, we have what we call a mechanism of exclusion, which will debar a heir of all or part of the succession because of the presence of a more entitled heir.
Understood. So a very clear, calculated mechanism depending on the numbers of heir or potential heir around the testator or the découillus, as we call it, the person that would pass
Correct.
away. So if we look into a normal family, quite large as it turned out, where we have a principal his mother and father still alive, he has a brother, he married, he has children, and he has all these assets today in his own name. In the event of him passing away, you have the proportion reflected here, and they are interesting. What you see, and to me, what is really striking are three things. One is that if the parents or one of them is or are still alive, up to 1/3 of that succession will go back to them. And you can already see the problem there in the event that the parents are, for example, of an old age already. That's probably not optimal, particularly when there are numerous children, etc. The other aspect, which if you look at it with outside of the Gulf eyes, is that the wife would get only a small portion in her own name. That doesn't mean she cannot benefit from all these assets, but she only gets a small portion directly. And that is something that not everyone is comfortable with. So perhaps we can look at the way to plan around this. And then you have the children, where if they are adults and they get this substantial proportion, particularly if there's a male here, you see that as something that works well in terms of passing the wealth to the next generation. But what if they are not in a very good economic situation? What if they are minors? Then you would have some sort of court supervision of these assets being passed to minors, and that's clearly suboptimal if you want to keep value of assets and increasing it over time. Okay, so this to demonstrate that it can be complicated and it is not always what the patriarch wants. So if we talk now to the tools are available, can Muslims plan for their succession?
Of course, and they should. Legacy planning, as you were just trying to say, is key to preserve and pass on the estate to the next generations in a smooth manner.
So why is it important to do so, to plan ahead and not to necessarily wait for one to pass away and then let the court decide?
Well, as we've just seen, Sharia does very well to provide for a fair allocation of assets, but it doesn't specifically address certain risks that may lead to dilution and or destruction of value, such as family disputes, irresponsible heirs, third-party attack, temporary freeze of assets, but also lengthy and costly court probate procedure.
I see. So now we saw that you can plan around. So what are the tools that people would use most often? I'll put them on the screen here as a hint. I touch about the notarial will or the foundation. So let's look at these in practice, how they differ and how they can be used by Muslims.
So there are several, yes, but in the UAE mainly we talk about wills, foundations, and trusts. One will have to choose and implement one or the other tool carefully in order to achieve the objectives. So Muslims can register a will, as we can see on the screen. That will be what we call the notarial will or the UAE will. But here his testamentary freedom will be limited to 1/3 of the estate. So it doesn't cover 100% of one's estate. And that will be subject to the approval of all major heirs. Remaining 2/3 will be as per the Sharia prescribed calculation we've just talked about.
And this is if one waits until one passes away, and this distribution would happen upon one's person death, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, as we've discussed last time, there are a few key concerns that wills will fail to address. Mainly, this is the probate procedure. So, because assets are still held in individual capacity during the individual's lifetime, these will inevitably be subject to probate procedure in case of demise. And the second one is the exposition to third parties' attack. And that's precisely where a foundation is going to add value. What's a foundation? If by now you still don't know, a quick refresher. A foundation is an independent legal entity that holds assets, so separately from the founder's personal wealth. It's compatible with all UAE and most international asset classes, so that's real estate, shares, portfolios. They enable entrepreneurs and their families to consolidate and keep control over income-generating assets and investments, while protecting them from potential threats, such as the one I have just listed. They are equally effective for non-Muslims and Muslims. They can be used in combination with corporate structure, either as a direct owner of assets or somewhere above the line, and that guarantees business continuity and smooth intergenerational planning.
So you mentioned equally effective for Muslim and non-Muslims. Let me question that a little bit. I want to know more. So what can you tell me about this working for Muslims? Because there is still a lot of noise out there saying, it's not possible for Muslims to plant. We are in a Muslim country. Would that be acceptable? Is that compatible with domestic assets? So what do you say?
It works, is what I say. So it was precisely with Muslim families in mind that the tool was first introduced in the region, and by now local authorities have widely embraced the concept. So but the starting point is that both the UAE Civil Code and the UAE Personal Affairs Law, which are, as we said earlier, the sources for inheritance and succession matters in the UAE, they both provide for the possibility of what we call a lifetime gift. So that means that a donor may lawfully make a gift of his property, 100% of his property, during his lifetime. That's what we call a disposition inter vivos. Or he may give it away to someone after his death by will. And that's the standard testamentary disposition. That both of these ways of giving property is permitted under Islamic law. There's one major difference, is that for a testamentary disposition, so a will, that's going to be limited to 1/3 of someone's estate. But with a disposition made inter vivos, so that's a lifetime gift while being alive, there's no maximum as to quantity. You can give up to 100% if you so wish. And to structure the latter, so the lifetime gift, that's where a foundation comes handy. So once you do this, you make sure that your assets are no longer subject to Sharia inheritance rules, and that can be made by a Muslim without circumventing Sharia principles at the same time. Potential distributions to beneficiaries, they can, but they don't have to, be made according to principles of Sharia still.
So if I hear you, the concept of lifetime gift is at the heart of making these foundation compatible with the law of the land, because
Absolutely.
we're actually planning ahead, doing something today, and as long as it remains fair, it is something that will be acceptable by the local authorities and very difficult, if not impossible, to contest by potential heir.
Absolutely.
So if we look at a couple of examples, you will recall our principal. Previously, he held his assets in his own name. Today, he followed your advice. He said, okay, I will set up a foundation, possibly with a small holding company. And with this, I will consolidate my business. I'll consolidate my real estate and some of my financial assets, whether listed stocks or portfolio. He can be the founder, meaning he creates this spark to set up this foundation, and he can be the first beneficiary. Very interestingly, he can also be one of the controllers. He can be one of the council members. And what we aim to do with that is first consolidating the assets and then protecting them. In the event that a threat would be to come against the founder, these assets would no longer be in his P&L and therefore protected. In the event that the founder was to pass away, then you see the assets are protected under this structure, and we can simply substitute the founder in his controller capacity. He will no longer be a beneficiary, probably substituted by his daughter and son in a proportion that he would predefine in the bylaws, and off we go. So when we talk about smooth intergenerational succession planning, business continuity, asset protection. This is really what is achievable today. And I thought that it would be topical to show a couple of these examples which have been done for Muslims and UAE national families particularly. This is a title deed. Everyone is familiar with them, has seen them. This one is actually held by a foundation, as it turned out, a DIFC foundation. And guess what? Founder, beneficiaries, UAE nationals. No problem. And this was land restricted to locals, as it turned out. Another example, a very popular free zone structure. Some GCC national actually own and operate these entities. A number of Muslims, not necessarily GCC national, own and operate these structures. It is possible now to have a foundation holding directly or indirectly shares in Jebel Ali free zone entity, and I put that example on purpose because it's a very large free zone, a free zone of relevance. Other free zones have embraced the concept too, so it's not only Jebel Ali, of course. And then at heart is the domestic business, the mainland business. And this example gives you the snap picture of a GCC family which owns a business 100%. It is allowed to do so. There's no restricted ownership for GCC national, and they have, as you see, restructured their business for business continuity. Founder has set up the foundation. He's the beneficiary, but the foundation holds this domestic LLC business. Now, we've seen these examples, these live examples of structuring various asset classes by Muslims and for Muslims in the UAE. What are some of the key considerations, Célia, on top of the donation that you mentioned before from whoever holds that assets to the foundation to make these structures effective?
Very good you ask. So there are a couple of things, and documentation is key here. So the founder will have to document the lifetime gift of his assets made from himself to the foundation, and more importantly, his intent to safekeep these assets in perpetuity for the benefit of his family. Something else to mention is that Islamic law does not include clawback provisions. That means that once a gift, a lifetime gift of 100% of your assets, for example, has been made and validly created, so that's as per the rules of contract law, it cannot be revoked and the transaction will be considered final. There are a couple of caveats, obviously. Sickness, duress, deceit, or lacking of capacity or capability, those could be causes for contestation by potentially rightful heirs willing to go after this, and this gift may be revoked via court order. But that's out of the ordinary. For founders wishing to abide by Sharia rules, a foundation, as we said, may be structured in a Sharia-compliant fashion. So that means that that's a possibility for whoever wishes to have Sharia compliance in the distribution mechanisms itself within the foundation. But asset distribution that does not follow Quranic rules of inheritance may also be considered Sharia compliant to the extent that the distribution mechanisms are documented by the founder by means of what we call a letter of wishes and are based on the concept of fairness and justice, which you've touched upon. For those willing to go one step further, it can be vetted by an Islamic scholar. So a fatwa or an opinion from the local Awqaf authority can also be sought to confirm the compliance of the structure and the governance with Islamic succession principles. So that's what you're showing on the screen. By now, it has been a few years now that the foundations are around, so we now have precedents of authorities formally taking position on the use of foundations being compatible with the law of the land. I'll give you an example. We have recently brought to the Awqaf attention the following question. I'll read it to you because the words matter. So, what is the Sharia position on the validity of the transfer of the entirety of an individual's assets during his lifetime to a foundation of which he is the sole primary beneficiary, along with his children, sons and daughters, as secondary beneficiaries in equal shares? you won't guess the answer. It was unequivocal. Sorry. It confirmed that the Sharia, as applied by the UAE, allowed such endowments of assets during one's lifetime while still benefiting from the income generated by the assets. So that means, from a Sharia standpoint, and as vetted by an Islamic scholar, there is no problem in doing this.
So so for all of you, this is fantastic news. So for all of you that are out there and saying, well, it's not tested, well, how can we trust the DFC, which as it turned out is the sixth financial center in the world by most metrics today. How can we trust ADGM, which is not far behind? These are tier one financial centers with a proper rule of law and everything there, including something called a firewall provision, enabling this structure to defend against any potential attack. But that's only part of the equation. If the domestic authorities, if the local families were not embracing the concept, it would be worthless. And you see the success of these tools today is based on these two, is the compatibility of the sophisticated structure available in DFC and ADGM, the local families using them as a result of them being embraced by the local supervision authorities in terms of compliance, Sharia, etc. And you see it here. That's the fatwa that Célia mentioned before. It is unequivocal. There is no doubt that the case specific presented to the authorities, which had indeed one daughter, one boy, and the split here, the governance was to say after the patriarch, it was 50-50, was perfectly acceptable because of the lifetime donation that preceded it. So it works. Foundation can help both Muslims and not Muslims to consolidate their domestic, regional, and international assets. It can help them segregate these assets from potential attack and avoiding them falling under probate procedure, which again would trigger dilution, possibly dispute between heirs. That's something one wants to avoid if you want to safekeep value of, let's say, a business, a group, or a pot of real estate. It also enables something that is very dear to many entrepreneurs is, can I keep control? The answer is yes, you can keep control to a large extent. Sometimes too much control is bad for you. I will talk about this in some subsequent podcasts, but as a rule, one can be the key controller in a foundation without destroying some of the benefits of that a foundation will bring to the table. It works for Muslims. There are substantial number of precedents where families are using the tool, did their research, sought advices, sought opinion, including from the authorities, and are now doing that on a regular basis, and implement their legacy planning strategies as Muslim using foundation, be it in a fully Sharia compliant way or in a way that is compliant with the law of the land, but where the distribution would not necessarily be what would happen to these assets. Would they stay in the P&L of the patriarch, where now you do a lifetime gift, so they are completely separated. I think we tried to cover the topic as simply as we could. It's not necessarily a simple topic, but what we wanted to share is our experience handling that with Muslims, for Muslims. As a rule of thumb, just so you know, 40% of our clients today are Muslims. So if we look at the largest community, whether by nationality or by faith, this is the biggest one. So there is the need, and here is the answer. Anything to add, Célia, before we can pause for another week?
No, I think you've said it all.
All right, so I'll thank you for that. It was very enlightening to get your practical perspective on the topic. Next week, we'll go slightly more granular and look in depth into the different key parties that are involved in the foundation, what their role is, what their obligations are, and should one accept to take one of these roles, etc., so that you get a good understanding of how the tool works. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and see you soon for another MHQ's Foundation 101 podcast. Goodbye.